Hey guys, Dr. Epic here, back with some more Metagel for you. Today I wanted to talk about a theory circulating the Mass Effect community the past few years. There is a spectre haunting Europe. After all, while waiting for the next Mass Effect, all we have to do is speculate and theorize. Today's theory is the theory that the Protheans could become the next villains of the Mass Effect franchise. I will not get bogged down in how this could physically happen in the Mass Effect universe, but instead I will focus on whether or not this should happen, from a story perspective. The case for how they could become villains is simple and doesn't need to be a 10-minute video. It is established through the accounts of Javik that the Prothean society was an empire built on assimilation. So they would have possible motive to become villains. It is further established throughout the entire OG trilogy that the Protheans have the technology to at least plausibly survive into our time with stasis technology.
Be careful, he's confused.
Alternatively, it's no secret that Javik, at least through most of his life, considered other species weaker and only fit to either perish, challenge, or join their empire, if worthy. Something he bases in his interpretation of the Prothean philosophy of the so-called cosmic imperative. If no other Protheans lived, then Javik could set in motion plans to bring back Prothean rule, or something akin to it. This gives the Protheans means to become villains. And with Javik alive, at least a short time after the final mission, no matter what you encourage him to do with the memory shard, and the Reapers are dead, Leviathans and galactic turmoil and who knows what's out there, the Protheans also have opportunity to become villains. Having said all this, I don't think anyone has any lore problems with the Protheans potentially returning, even as villains. The next pivotal question though is, should they become villains? First off, let's establish some parameters and define the term villain in the Mass Effect game context. You have main villains, and you have side villains. Some villains gain more spotlight and impact the story more than others. Like in Mass Effect 2, the main villain in regards to a driving force behind the story is the Reapers, but you never meet them directly, unlike Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 3. The Collectors are drones and pawns of the Reapers, but isolated they are their own thing. But it's no question that the Collectors, Harbinger and the Reapers are the main villain in Mass Effect 2. You also have a range of other antagonists that you can call side villains, like of course the mercenary bands you fight pretty often in Mass Effect 2, and even the Geth, which were, if not the main villain of Mass Effect 1, at least direct pawns and representatives of the main villain Sovereign and the Reapers. Furthermore, villains can take different forms, such as concrete, tangible, physical creatures, like the Geth or Ket, or more abstract as a theme, concept, or force of nature, more like the Scourge or the dark energy problem of Haestrom. Now, would the Protheans make good villains with these parameters? Let's get my bias out of the way, as before we start. As a clear starting point, I don't think that the Protheans should become the main villains. I think they should be left alone and extinct as they were. I believe they've had their whole story in the OG trilogy oriented on the Reaper War basically, as did Javik's, and it was concluded in a good way. I feel like that it would be nearly impossible to bring them back without introducing even more Prothean artifacts, and this would stretch my suspension of disbelief perhaps beyond the breaking point, as I already felt there were a bit too much functioning Prothean technology in a galaxy supposedly wiped clean by the Reapers. Ruins are one thing, but functioning data terminals, VIs, and technology, that's a whole nother thing. Even though I think their story is closed and done, I would of course be open to them reopening the book if it lets the writers do something new and exciting, and most importantly, good. I just want the writers to be careful, because this is essentially what 343 Industries did with Halo, and it worked to, let's say, mixed responses. Even though I find it hard to imagine that the Protheans would make a good main villain, I'm more likely to believe that they can make good side villains if they were to make a villainous appearance at all. In this I mean that they work as a small assistant to the main villain, kind of how the heretic Geth assisted the Reapers in OG trilogy, and of course the Collectors in Mass Effect 2. I think that Mass Effect 4, which seems to be a preferred term for the next Mass Effect game, despite it being the 5th main installment, needs a new villain, preferably related to Andromeda storyline somehow. But to bring in a new villain is scary in an established universe. Here I think the Protheans, as much as any other villain in Mass Effect, could serve as a bridge between the new and the old Mass Effect stories. Sort of like how in Halo 4, in the new Halo storyline, you are introduced to the familiar Covenant at first, and shortly after you are introduced to the new villain of the Prometheans or foreigners, however you want to interpret it. For instance, imagine a smaller rogue Prothean stasis group that basically had their own version of the Andromeda Initiative in their day, coming to the conclusion that they have to fight the Reapers with their own weapons. Escaping in secret to Andromeda, starting to create their own Reaper, subjugating and simulating those native Andromedans if they opposed them. At some point they wage war with the Jardan as their opposition, and all but a few Protheans lose their lives in this war due to the Scourge deployment and such. In the next game, these few surviving Protheans wish to complete the project in building the Reaper. They come to the conclusion that they need some concrete Reaper technology, something they obviously didn't bring along due to the risk of indoctrination. They now realize they have to venture back to the Milky Way. Using some science and advanced technology, the Protheans had technology advanced enough to blow up stars and create a minimass relay in Mass Effect 1, just so you know, and they travel back to Milky Way to find the Citadel or something like that. And there we have it, action. Now that doesn't sound too bad, hopefully. There's at least potential, alright? And if the Protheans had a role such as that, I think it could work fine in a new story. Essentially, I don't have a conclusive argument why the Protheans should not under any circumstance become the next villains, but I do think that the arguments against it are too significant to ignore. I fear it would be too constricting on the writers for little gain in form of fan service, and I think the story would suffer needlessly much if they had to force the Protheans in somehow. But like I said, the Protheans are a fundamental, integral part of the Mass Effect universe, so they would of course have to be mentioned in that sense. They should focus on making a logical and satisfying villain now that the galaxy is renewed. Make it new. The Mass Effect formula isn't reliant on having the same old villains. On the contrary, Mass Effect is blessed with a vast universe in which to tell stories, due to solid rules with a healthy suspension of disbelief. In conclusion, as it stands, I don't think the Protheans should be the next villain in Mass Effect. If you agree or disagree, you can like or comment why, of course. There's likely things that me and others haven't thought about since Mass Effect is such a big fiction universe. Remember, like if cool, dislike if cringe. Dr. Epic, signing out.
I thought the collectors kept to themselves.
They usually work through intermediaries, like slavers or hired mercenaries. If they're involved with the Reapers somehow, it could explain what happened to the colonies.
The collectors have advanced technology. They could have a weapon that disables an entire settlement at once.
The Seeker swarms.